this is the introduction to the book of Joshua. So when we're looking at an overview on the book of Joshua, pretty much we need to know that it was written mainly between the year 1410, which is roughly around the same time as Deuteronomy, and also this was also written around between 410 and 1350 BC. So that's the book of Joshua. So the time span that it actually covers is about 15 to 26 years is what it covers, because when Joshua entered into the promised land, remember that he was already 40 years wandering in the desert as well as Moses and all the other old generation that was there that passed away. And when he entered into the promised land, he basically spent a lot of those years conquering the land. So Joshua was that man that God used after the death of Moses. God raises up Joshua and places him in charge of the people. And so therefore he uses Joshua, now a warrior, to go and lead the people to fight the wars in Canaan and conquer that land, and to also establish that continuous service to God. So what we're going to have a look at here is, firstly, the name Joshua. It means Jehovah is salvation. Okay. Now, the book of Joshua, when we're looking at this, Joshua was mainly, the author of the book of Joshua was mainly Joshua himself. You know, Joshua himself was the one that wrote the book of Joshua, and it was named after, after Joshua. But at the same time, it's also believed that the elders, some of the elders in the time of Joshua, may have also written Joshua chapter 24 verse 31, because it speaks about his death, and also just like what we saw in the book of Deuteronomy, when Moses wrote about, when it was written about Moses' death, it's believed that there were other people that wrote about that part, because obviously Moses being dead, he wouldn't have been able to have written that. So a background about the book of Joshua. So Joshua is almost, basically, remember, Joshua is the person who was almost stoned to death by his own people back in Numbers chapter 14 verse 6 to 10. Nearly 40 years before the book of Joshua begins, because out of the 12 spies that went to Canaan in the time of Moses, Joshua was one of those 12 spies, as well as Caleb. And only Joshua and Caleb came back with good news to obey God and take the land, to conquer the land. Because everybody else, all the other 10 spies' unbelief to accept God's covenant, the children of Israel spent 40 years in the wilderness, but Joshua, which was Moses' successor, is then at this point preparing to lead Israel from the wilderness in their conquest to the promised land. Okay, so remember, Deuteronomy ends with Moses going up into the mountain where God told him that you will look at the land from here, the land of Canaan that flows with milk and honey, but you will not enter in, because Moses was not permitted to enter in. He just was able to look at it from afar. So where was this written, the book of Joshua? It was mainly written in the east of the Jordan River, because they hadn't crossed over yet, remember. So it was written on the east of the Jordan River, which is a part of the wilderness before the conquest, and west of the Jordan River, also in the land of Canaan. So to who was it written? It was written to the Israelites. So now let's go into this. Let's look at Joshua chapter 1 verse 1 to 9. Okay, we're going to look at Joshua chapter 1 verse 1 to 9, and that's the very beginning of Joshua. And this is how it begins. It says, "Now after the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord, it came to pass that the Lord spoke unto Joshua the son of Nun, Moses' minister, saying, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now therefore arise, go over this Jordan, you and all this people, unto the land which I do give to them, even to the children of Israel. Every place that the sole of your foot shall tread upon, that have I given unto you, as I said unto Moses. From the wilderness and this Lebanon, even unto the great river, the river Euphrates, all the land of the Hittites, and unto the great sea, toward the going down of the sun, shall be your coast. There shall not any man be able to stand before you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will not fail you, nor forsake you. Be strong and of a good courage, for unto this people shall you divide for an inheritance the land which I swore unto their fathers to give them. Only be you strong and very courageous, that you may observe to do according to all the law which Moses my servant commanded you. Turn not from it to the right hand or to the left, that you may prosper wherever you go. This book of the law shall not depart out of your mouth, but you shall meditate therein day and night, that you may observe to do according to all that is written therein. For then you shall make your way prosperous, and then you shall have good success. Have not I commanded you? Be strong and of a good courage. Be not afraid, neither be you dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. Praise the Lord. Hallelujah. So when we look at this, beloved brethren, we can see here that this is how the book of Joshua commences, because God is now sending this warrior to lead his people Israel to go and conquer this land, which they already saw the types of people that were there. There were fierce people, there were giants that they had to go and fight against and overcome them. There were cities which were with basically considered in that time with impenetrable walls, thick and large walls that you could not really go in and defeat them so easily. So this is the difficulties, this is, you could say, the impossibilities that they had to overcome. And God, being the God of the impossibilities, making the impossible possible, made it possible to them as long as they remained faithful to the Lord and obedience. So let's look into this a little bit further now, shall we? So it begins, as you remember, the story began with Abraham. Abraham received the promise that God will make a big nation from him. So the nation was then called Israel. Remember Jacob, his name was changed to Israel. And then from Israel, out of the tribe of Levi, was Moses, which was brother of Aaron and Miriam. They also are of the tribe of the Levites. Now Moses went up into Mount Sinai when, to receive the commandments, the 10 commandments, and also the rest of the law. And then from there, when they sinned, the people had sinned because God told them to go into the promised land, but they disobeyed. They were wanting to stone Joshua and Caleb to death, and God intervened and basically said to them, because they didn't obey and because they didn't believe God, therefore they have to wander for 40 years or almost thereof, 40 years in the desert, until all that old generation died away, but their children, who were children at the time, and those who were born along the way, God permitted them to enter into the promised land. Now, when we look at the other image just there a little bit below, that one is basically then showing that now, just before they were about to cross the Jordan River, Moses speaks to them and he says, obey God, you're about to enter the promised land. Now, it's very interesting how God, before they entered the land, God gives them the law, and he gives them that they need to understand it, that they need to obey it, that they need to love God. Before they entered the promised land, he gave them the law. Yeah. It's almost like, a lot of times when we go to a place, if we're going to go visit another country, often we go to the other country, and when we end up getting into troubles because we didn't read on the laws, then we're like, oh, this is my situation, I ended up in this. Or if we buy a product and we, throw away the manual and we just destroy something because we didn't use it properly, because we didn't read the instructions. So this is why, God is very orderly, and he's given them a law to follow so that they can be a blessing, and so that God can use them for his purpose, as well as so that God can so that these people can live prosperly in that new land that God is giving them. So then we enter into Joshua chapter 1 to 5 basically covers the following things. When we look at Joshua chapter 1, we see how God says to them, as well as Joshua, he says, obey the commandments of the law, which is in the Hebrew, Torah. Okay? So that's what they're told basically in chapter 1. Chapter 2, we then see that they start to prepare to cross that Jordan River, but they send out some spies, and they send out these spies to go and spy the land. It was only 2 of them that they sent to the land of Jericho. Now, when they went to the land of Jericho, you might remember the lady called Rahab. All right, we've spoken about her before. This lady Rahab was also you could say she was a harlot. She was a woman who, they used to pay her for sexual pleasure. Now, that was obviously a sinful woman, but when she realized that, and the whole city of Jericho realized that this nation of Israel was coming because God was sending them to destroy these people, she feared God. And so when she comes across these 2 spies, she gave them a place in her house, and she hid the spies, and she says, help me, spare my life, spare my family, spare my dad, and don't kill us. Basically, this woman became an Israelite. She was, put into the Jewish nation. And this woman was also the woman in the bloodline of Jesus Christ the Messiah. Because after her, they had given birth to other people along in the bloodline, which pretty much comes to the bloodline of Jesus Christ. So you might want to have a look into that. These stories that are in there are very, very important. Okay, so then when we look at other events that happen in chapter 3 to 4 of Joshua, we then see that God does the miracle of parting. He basically cut off the Jordan River when it was running at the highest, because sometimes the rivers rise and sometimes they're very low. But when the river was at its highest, God gave command to Joshua, and he says to Joshua to command the priests, the Levite priests, that they should bear the ark in front of all of the people. Why? Because the Ark of the Covenant, where it basically had the 10 commandments in there, they also had put the rod of Aaron, which budded and blossomed, and they also put in there one of the breads of the manna. Okay, they put it in a jar, and that was all that Moses put, those 3 things in there, which all leads to Christ, because that Ark of the Covenant basically in that time represented that the very presence of God would be going with these people, and they were going before, like God was going in front of his people, leading them. So that's why they saw that miracle, because it was the Lord who was going before, representing the presence of God who was going before to lead them, and they saw that miracle to cross the Jordan River. So once they're on the other side, and in chapter 5, we start seeing how Joshua has an encounter with what's called a Christophany, because he sees a soldier, a person, and had his sword extended out. And he basically goes, are you for us or are you for the enemy? Are you on our side or are you on the side of the enemy? And he goes, neither. He goes, I am the commander-in-chief of God's armies. So then when Joshua recognized that he was speaking to the angel of the Lord, which we saw this study a few studies back, he bows down and he goes, what is the will of the Lord? And he says, take your sandals, take your shoes off your feet, because the ground on which you stand is holy ground. So this is a representation of basically what's called the angel of the Lord, but it's a representation or a manifestation of the very Christ. Okay, so that's basically the encounter which strengthens Joshua a lot more in his faith. So we also see that when we look back a little bit, we see that, you know, previously also God commands them, the Jews, he commands them to be circumcised, and he commands them to keep the Passover. And then when you look forward, God is now preparing them to enter into many years, what was many years of war between a lot of different nations around them. Okay, so then we go to chapter 6 to 12, and when we look at chapters 6 to 12, we start to then see that they go to battle with the Canaanites. All right, but before I enter into telling you the Canaanites, because the land of Canaan was a very, very big land, it had a lot of different nations in there. All right, and I'm going to mention a few after how many battles they had. But the thing is that why the Canaanites, this will explain why. Because God is righteous and he's just, and he needs justice and righteousness to be done on earth. So this is why he raised up the people of Israel to go and overcome these other people who were buried in sin for years. Now we're talking years upon years of sin. What sort of sin? Well, we see that the Canaanites, or the people in the land, would practice such bad things as they were morally corrupt, meaning that, for example, if you see in Leviticus chapter 18, you'll find that there was a moral corruption. There was, you know, the way people would think, there was a lot of perverseness. There was a lot of things going on which were very abominable before God. And on top of that, they would also do child sacrifices. Imagine that, a mother or a father, they take their child or their baby and they would go and burn it and sacrifice it onto their devil gods. You can see that in Deuteronomy chapter 12, verse 29 to 31. So this is why God had had enough of all that sin, of all that blood spill that they would do and the injustice. So God was basically bringing the Israelite nation to punish them for the wickedness and for the sins of many things. Now, when we look at what God was basically saying to the people of Israel, he didn't command them to go and totally destroy every single nation. All right, so that's what point 2 is saying, that God did not command the genocide of every single people. There was only certain nations that he said, don't even spare the women, the children, the infants, not even the cattle or the animals, because these people had contaminated through sin, and all their practices had contaminated even the animals as well. So there were some nations where God said, kill them all off. You cannot leave any of them behind. And there were other nations in the land of Canaan that God said, drive them out, you know, get them out of there. You can't, you know, I'm giving you the land, but I'm not telling you to kill them off either. So, you know, if they go to war with you, then obviously you're going to go to war with them. But when you overcome them, you're not to kill them all off. You need to, you know, drive them out. You know, kick them out of that land is basically what he instructed them to do. And then you've basically got some unique moments in history where peace with other nations, you see some peace with other nations were given, but not with all. There was certain nations that God had in mind that he needed to bring judgment on those nations, and therefore God used these people of Israel to bring the judgment of God upon them. So let's look at the first example there when we're looking at this chapter 6 to 12. So the battle with the Canaanites. In chapter 6, we see the battle at Jericho, all right? And we see that when they were obedient to God, God's faithfulness giving them the victory. So they didn't actually try and fight in this battle to get into the wall of Jericho, but what they did was, under the command of Joshua, and Joshua had received this instruction from God. He basically said, on the first day you go around the wall of Jericho, don't make any noise, and once you finish, the priests who had the trumpets, remember the trumpets that we read about not that far ago, there was 2 silver trumpets they made, and God said, when you go to war, you blow these trumpets and I'll remember you. Remember that? So they blew the trumpets, and what happens is that the wall fell down. All right, on the 7th day that they blew the trumpets, that last day they went around 7 times, then they blew the trumpets. God then did a miracle and gave them the victory. So when the wall fell down flat, basically the whole army of Israel went in and slaughtered everybody except for Rahab, the woman, because her and her family were spared because she hid the spies of Israel. And so therefore they had that agreement. And when we then look at chapter 7 to 8, now things were going well, but you got to remember, when there is disobedience, and this also applies to us as well, if we're obedient to God, God's faithful always, we're going to see his victories no matter how hard or impossible it is. We're going to see God do great and mighty works out of where we least expect it. Okay? But there came a time when they went and battled against the people of Ai. All right? Now, in this particular case, those people didn't have, it wasn't a big nation. I'll tell you what, the land of the people, the nation of Ai, it was only 12,000 people, a population of about 12,000. But you know what happened? When they had gone to look at battling, there was a person called Achan, and he ended up seeing some gold and some silver. Remember, when God said, don't even take the gold, don't take the silver, don't take nothing, because everything is contaminated with sin. God would not have none of it. But on this occasion, there was a man who coveted, he wanted it. And he let himself be taken over by the temptation and disobeyed God's law. So he ended up trying to hide some gold and silver and some clothes under his own tent. And therefore, when the people of Israel went to go and fight against the nation of Ai, basically they could not win. They couldn't overcome them. And so they had some people that died. The Israelites had some people that suffered losses. And then you see Joshua comes before God and he's saying, God, what's going on? Because we just read it as well. Remember in Joshua chapter 1, verse 1 to 9, we read it when God said that no man shall be able to stand up before you. Wherever you go, you will, overcome. You will. So what went wrong? Now, at this point, Joshua didn't know what had happened. So that's why he went to God and he's like, God, what is going on? God then reveals. Now, this is also part of the gifts of the Spirit, because God revealed to Joshua through the gift of the word of knowledge. And he says, the people of Israel have sinned. That's why they cannot stand before their enemies. And they won't be able to unless the sin is put away. And then he reveals to him. So then on the following day, they get this family and they burn the man called Achan. They kill his family. They cut off all the sin. And then they were given the victory. All right. So this tells us a lot of things, brethren, that whenever there's battles, and I'll tell you what, there's some battles that are harder than others that we go through as Christians. But what this is trying to tell us, brethren, is that with God, all things are possible. When we step out of line and when we start disobeying, we're going to see things turn on us. And we're going to see ourselves that we're not going to be in the victories that we were before until we put away the sin, until we put away the disobedience to God in our life and we start doing what God has said. So to inherit the land, Israel had to be obedient. In order for us to get to the end, we need to be obedient. In order for us to win the battles that come in this lifetime, we need to be obedient. So all of this is an example and a teaching even for us. So then, we then see in chapter 9, all right, now here's another example in chapter 9. there were a certain people, a certain nation called the Gibeonites. Now, the Gibeonite people were a people that God had told Joshua and the people of Israel that they need to, they need to wipe them out. They need to go and take them out of the land. But the Gibeonites were worried, they were afraid, and they said, hey, let's go and trick them, Let's put some old bread and some old shoes and old socks and old clothes, and we're going to tell them that we're from really far away. We're from a really, really far country, not from the land of Canaan, but we're from a different country. But we've come, and we want to make we want to be friends with the Israelites, because we've heard of their God, how their God, what their God did to the land of Egypt, what their God did to at Jericho. So basically they lied. But this teaches us something else as well. You know why? Because Joshua didn't wait and go to God and say, God, who are these people? They say this. Tell me, Lord, should I make friendship with them? Very interesting, isn't it? Because he didn't do that. And so when they made a friendship with them, you got to remember that they made like a promise. And they said, we promise we will not destroy you. We will make a friendship with you. But you know what? 3 days after, they realized, hey, these people aren't from a far country at all. They're the ones that just live there in the land of Canaan. And they're part of the people that God told us to wipe them out. Now, because they had given their word, they could no longer do that, because otherwise the wrath of God was going to pour out on Israel as well. So, what does this teach us? We can't trust in our decisions. We need to bring things before God, because there's a lot of deceivers out there as well. Now, in this case, these Gibeonites, obviously the people of Israel made them, to be the woodcutters and to bring them water and, to be like servants, their servants. But hey, they were all right with that, because it's like, hey, it was either that or destruction. So they chose, hey, we'll serve you, no worries. But then in chapter 10 and 11, we see that the Canaanite kings, like a lot of them get together and they go, hey, we got to destroy Israel, because now these Gibeonites have joined with them and they're getting a lot stronger. So you have, certain kings that get together and they go and fight against Israel, but God gives them the victory, because God had told them that he was going to, give them these kings into their hands. So in chapter 12, we start to then see how Israel has a lot of victories, yeah? So we see how they went and fought in Jericho, in Ai, Jerusalem, Hebron, Lachish, Eglon, Gezer, Debir, and the list goes on and on and on and on. They had about 31 to 33 wars with different kings. So that's a lot of wars in a lot of years, yeah? Took a lot of years for them to be conquering the land a bit at a time. So that's where we are till now. And then that takes us then to chapter 13 to 22. Now we find that during all this time, because you got to remember that they're conquering these lands and they're fighting against these kings, but that's not happening just in 1 year. That's happening over the course of between 15 to 26 years that it's taking. Now, Joshua is an old man now, and they got the promised land. But the thing is that now that Joshua is an old man, he can't really go out like he used to before. So what's happening is that Joshua, the land that they've now already got, Joshua starts to divide the land between the 12 tribes of Israel. All right, so he starts to say, okay, this portion is for you, this portion is for you, this portion is for you. And that was all based on what Moses had written down as well, based on the instruction of what God had given to them. So from Abraham, you see that the promise had started to come to fruition, all right? So something that God promised Abraham more than 400 years ago, but now it's starting to actually take place, and they're starting to see it, to live it, that God had given them this land and given them the victory. So for the Israelites, this was something that was very important, because it was the fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham, such as what God told Abraham in Genesis chapter 12, verse 6 and 7. When God calls out Abraham from his father's house, and he goes, go, and I'll give you a land that flows with milk and honey. Now, he didn't even tell him where. We didn't even know where he was going, but Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him for righteousness. And then towards the end of Joshua, the book of Joshua, towards the end, we start to see in chapter 23 and 24, the final words of Joshua. Now, we see the same sort of things as we saw in Deuteronomy. Moses says, love God and obey him. Joshua says to them, be faithful to God, be faithful to the Torah, obey the law of God. The life and blessings in the land that you have, that you see, is because you need to be faithful to God in order for you to be victorious. Now, I gotta let you know something. They didn't end up conquering all the land. There was still a lot of land to conquer. But hey, Joshua was old. They had conquered some land. They started dividing it, but the work still needed to be done. All right. So Joshua then says to them, all right, if you're unfaithful, you're going to cop it. But if you're faithful, then, you're going to get more of that land. You're going to be able to get more of the blessing. And as God has been with me and Moses, he's going to be with you and your children. All right. So what are they going to do? Praise the Lord. So when we have a look at the scripture, just to finish up, I just want to read the last book of Joshua, chapter 24, and we're going to read from verse 14 to 16. These were some of the last words of Joshua. He said, now therefore, fear the Lord and serve him in sincerity and in truth, and put away the gods which your fathers served on the other side of the flood and in Egypt, and serve you the Lord. And if it seem evil unto you to serve the Lord, choose you this day whom you will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served that were on the other side of the flood, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. So Joshua is basically going to them, I'm old now, you've been given warning after warning, but when I'm gone, whatever you choose to do, yous are going to do. But as for me and my house, we've chosen that we're going to be faithful to God. And verse 16 says, and the people answered and said, God forbid that we should forsake the Lord to serve other gods. So these are things that they made another promise before God. Yes, we're going to be faithful to God. So yes, brethren. So that's how this book starts to end in Joshua chapter 24. It finishes there with another warning from Joshua telling them, be faithful to God. God is good. Serve him faithfully with a sincere heart. Be honest and love God and obey him, which is the principal thing. And every time they would obey God, they would see the victories of God. When they were disobedient, they would see that they would be losing in battle. So they went through these experiences as well. So what do we also see here? For example, in the content, we see that the book of Joshua is primarily a book of history. All right, so it gives us a recount, a history of what happened in the people of Israel when they crossed the border, how they got that land, and the interactions that they had with God and how God was guiding them. So we also see that Joshua was the leader in that time under the divine guidance of God. And Joshua engages in 3 strategic military operations using brilliant divide and conquer tactics, ensuring victory over the enemy's armies in Canaan. God's miraculous interventions, because there were moments when, in Joshua, it was the famous, when they were going to conquer certain lands where he would raise the spear and he says, to the sun, stay where you are, moon, you stay where you are. And so basically, those were frozen for pretty much a whole day. They were frozen and, they were able to overcome their victory. So there were some really, really big miracles going on. There were other miracles as well when they were going to overcome their enemies. And then there were these like massive blocks of stone like hail that would fall from heaven and kill off the enemy. So God would actually get involved in part of the victories as well. and he would basically wipe off the other people that were in that land. So, brethren, that's pretty much Joshua. So we see that we can outline it as something where the preparation of Israel to conquer Canaan. We can see that the conquest in Canaan, we can see how the land was then divided up to each of the tribes, and we also see the farewell and the death of Joshua in the book of Joshua.